So, why do I want to talk about the business perspective in ESG, and why now? So 2 years ago, conversations on this topic felt like howling into the void. The very little interest, beyond, a few evangelists, but in general, very little interest. But the last 2 years have shifted the world on its axis. So what we've all lived through with COVID has given everyone an understanding at a visceral level of how interconnected our world is, of how the food we buy, the clothes we wear, are part of a global interconnected supply chain, and a disruption in one place will impact our lives and our supermarket shelves here. I mean, for a lot of people, it was a shock to realize through the war in Ukraine that that's going to affect bread prices. So there's a different understanding of the interconnectedness, and people no longer think they can put up the walls and we're safe here. So that's one driver. Another is COVID has changed people's personal points of view. We've all been locked up. Anyone who could get outside, I think, has a different appreciation for nature, but people are also much more aware of what's important to them and what their values are. There's been a lot too much time to think, often, across that period of time. And we're seeing the Great Resignation, and we're seeing people vote with their feet. We're seeing, particularly in graduate recruitment, the list of, before the grads wouldn't apply to defence or tobacco. But now they're looking at the net zero targets, they're looking at the climate commitments, and we're seeing a really differential availability of talent to companies that have an attractive offering in this space. And that, to date, it's more so the millennials, but interestingly also the diverse candidates, so which I found quite fascinating. And then when it comes to customers and consumers, I think people are very aware that spending is voting. If I'm choosing to spend my money on this product, I am choosing to endorse the model of that company. Because now with social media, you're one Twitter storm away from realizing that in fact your Tesco Christmas cards were produced using child labor. And Tesco didn't know. Tesco didn't employ child labor, but Tesco didn't have appropriate oversight of their suppliers and their suppliers' suppliers, and suddenly they're on the front of the papers. So the level of focus has shifted. So for me, that's why there's so much more discussion and passion around this topic than there was 2 years ago. But I still think much less than there will be in 2 years' time. Because we're now at the, this is probably important stage. But I think in 2 years' time, it'll be a lot more codified, and we'll be a lot clearer on the drivers, because some of our assumptions now about how it'll play out will become a little bit clearer. So, the 4 things. Why is it business critical? And for this, I have 2 hideous slides. Pure consulting, very dense. I'm not going to read all of them, but it's useful to have for reference afterwards. There's some good stats and some good examples. So don't panic when you see the tiny things. It's for reference. One thing I think that is interesting, as we talk to CEOs, CFOs, and chief procurement officers, what are the questions keeping them awake at night on this agenda? Because as I said, people are still on the journey. Only about 20% of companies have a board-level chief sustainability officer. Almost everywhere else, it's reporting to the CPO, the CFO, or the CEO, or in one memorable case, to the chief marketing officer. A large bank, a very large bank, and we were very gently trying to explain that whilst it was lovely that this individual had passion for the topic, perhaps the optics were not ideal. We'll touch briefly on supply chains and sustainability, because that's my baby, and then touch on the talent agenda piece, which I'm guessing is your baby. So stop me as we go through. Oh wow, that is fully illegible. So fundamentally, it's to try and talk about the 2 sets of drivers, the carrot and the stick. So on the one hand, there's avoiding risk. Part of that risk is the ones we've talked. Part of it is regulatory. There's a TCFD, all of those things are coming down the track, and certain boards and certain companies will move at 1 centimetre faster than regulation pushes them. Whereas others are at the other side, trying to say, where is the upside for me? Where will I be an early adopter? Where are the big benefits? So they'll be more on the right, on the values and benefits. Securing capital, as Matt's just talked, is certainly becoming much more of a factor. Operational resilience has been a really interesting one. So early in the pandemic, we were working with an outdoor clothing manufacturer. And almost all of their firstly, sales were going through the roof because you couldn't socialize in any other way. And almost all of their factories were in Turkey. So we're fine. China's not going to affect us. They had, I think, 5 suppliers, all of whom sourced their buttons from the same part of China. So their entire supply chain halted because they had no buttons. So people have a totally different view now on supply chain resilience. So say 10 years ago in supply chain, the coolest thing was just in time. You go, my supply chain's so robust, I just open the back door and the stuff has arrived. I don't know and I don't need to know. Now people realize they need to know. You need to have visibility. You need to understand the ethics, but you also need to understand your backup supply. So that's a big shift from just in time to just in case. That's really moved it around a lot. And that drives cost. I mean, nothing in this world is free. So there's a real trade-off on the cost efficiency versus the cash within that. But now priced into that in a way it wasn't is the risk management piece. And pharma have always been good at this because the nature of your FDA approval of the drugs, you must say exactly what the ingredients are. And if there's 2 types of an ingredient, you must have both of those stated. So they've gotten better at having all of that redundancy built into the supply chain, particularly for the critical drugs. I worked in pharma, and for things, for the aspirins, if we make it, we make it. But for the cancer drugs, you say, I must have 100% supply. There must never be a patient who needs this drug who doesn't have it. So they have probably some of the role models around those really resilient, but quite expensive supply chains. And then the new climate-centric markets, there are areas of business opening up, and we're not supposed to name names of companies, are we? Some oil majors have fascinating web pages. And to read it, you would think they're all about renewable energy. And then you actually open up the details of their reports and go, oh, 1.5%. Wow. So it's really interesting to see what that transition piece looks like. So in my place in Baringa, we've got a team working around the energy transition. And they're amazing. I mean, I understand this much of what they tell me. But they're the guys programming how to transition to hydrogen and all of those big pieces. So some businesses are absolutely grabbing that, and some are cowering in terror. So that's, I think, quite an interesting one as we see it flow through. And then in the small print, which you can't read, you've got loads of the examples to quote on environment, on social and governance. And I think your points on diversity is interesting, because we've been talking about diversity forever, but doing very little. And again, I see that agenda shifting. As a woman of a certain age, I had that childbearing decade where no headhunter in the country phoned me. And my peers and I now that we're sort of well into our 40s, every headhunter in the country seems to have my number. There's just this huge focus on, oh, you're a senior woman. Yes, but it's not my only characteristic, but thank you. So there is, because some of them think it's a good opening line either. I know I'm a senior woman. Why are you calling me? What is this discussion? So yes, the D&I piece is moving up the agenda. And again, these are your horrible stats. But the point of this is the numbers are bloody huge. We're talking about scope 3 emissions, depending on the industry, in some cases are 90% of emissions. But some annual reports they just talk about scope 1 and 2, what's within their own control. Okay, that'll get you so far, but not that much further. The 51 billion tons of global greenhouse gases emitted per year, it's an interesting figure. And it was actually the Bill Gates book that sort of put it in my head, because when he's talking about his investments, which are obviously on a different scale to our investments, he's trying to say, okay, if it's not going to impact 1% of the total burden, then it's not big enough for me to get into. But when you see some of the smaller things and then you measure them against the scale of that, you go, okay, that is a drop in the ocean. One that was a surprise to me was the extent of modern slavery. I hadn't realized that it was 740 million is the estimated number of victims, predominantly women and children. It was colleagues in forensics who sort of opened my eyes to that. So that to me was a surprise, that still in our world today is such a huge challenge. And that's something that visibility is rising up on as there is more and more reporting. Fast fashion, all of these things are going to be more and more impacted by this because the awareness now of what goes into, of what is the cost of that £5 t-shirt. So that one was a big one for me. In terms of investments, we're talking about, in financial reports, 56% of the G250 companies now include these figures in their reports, in their annual reports. And the rest will probably wait until they're forced through legislation, but that's coming quite quickly. So before I was in Baringa, I was in Big Four, and the audit team had built this really big reporting function, because they could see that it's coming down the tracks that annual reports will need all of these climate disclosures. TCFD, I think, is the first wave, but there will certainly be more and more. So it's going from abstract to tangible faster than some boards, I think, realize. So it's an interesting time. And the figure there, 25% growth in sustainable investment in the last 2 years, I expect that figure to tick up, and tick up significantly. So, our beloved CPOs, CFOs, CEOs, what are the questions they're asking us most? The CPO, in many cases, the Chief Procurement Officer, is where the rubber hits the road. Because again, the spending is voting point. They have traditionally been measured on cost, in some places also on service, and some on cost of ownership if they're being really forward-thinking. But right now, they're being held accountable in many cases to the sustainability strategy, because the Scope 3 is predominantly influenced by what they buy. And one they're really struggling with, because carbon is reasonably easy to measure, is diversity. Because they're saying we must have diverse suppliers. But diversity is not as easy to measure as it was 20 years ago. Even the concept of gender is no longer a binary box that gets ticked. And when it comes to all of the other dimensions of diversity, I think there's slightly over 100 sort of certification bodies that people could be members of. So there's a real lack of a decent scale around that. So that's a challenge for companies that are trying to procure across a diverse spend base, just how you measure that. There's greenwashing, but also there's challenges there. For the CEO, measuring that risk and opportunity from a climate lens in their business operating model is an increasingly challenging and increasingly more important question. And particularly the non-executive directs are asking more and more questions and trying to learn more in this space. You know, that's the role, to ask the difficult and provoking questions. But trying to get granular is still a challenge. The CFO is probably looking more at their asset portfolio. So physical transition risk is becoming more and more relevant. I think just before the pandemic, the examples we were using were the fires in Australia and the floods in Yorkshire. You know, both really dramatic level, climatic incidences in places you wouldn't traditionally have expected that. We've sort of almost written off certain parts of America as just where they go on fire every summer. But the entire vineyards of Australia was a surprise. Another one for the CEO is getting sustainable purpose into core business functions. And the purpose piece, I think, is a challenge. We know people care about it. We know it's a big part of engagement. But it's challenging in many cases to build a proposition around the type of work we do versus what people are interested in. So that purpose-led leadership, it feels like something a lot of people are struggling with, and how to do that in an effective way. Now this says the CEO is the one worrying about how to get to the net zero target. I don't think it's the CEO. I think the CEO has stood at this lectern and made his net zero commitments, but he will be on his yacht before the day, or 2030 or 2040 or whatever date they've put down. It's generally the level below that are calling, you know, my team and I going, you'll never guess what he's just said. So we're doing a lot of work now, companies going, well, what is your net zero plan? Can we do the maths for you? Just to understand, have you a hope in hell of hitting that target that's been set externally? And if not, what are the levers you can pull? Or do you want to go back and change the commitment? But in many cases, an aspirational target has been set without a particularly clear understanding of how to make it real. So I don't think it's CEOs that are losing sleep on that. I think it's the generation behind them who are going to need to deliver it, who are, and probably should be, losing sleep on that. So quite a few insomniacs at the moment tied to this agenda. Any of those sort of surprising or resonate? Okay, some insomniacs here too then, good stuff. The talent agenda. And this is a few sort of fairly basic ones. The focus on purpose. We've really seen that drive up the agenda. We've known grads cared, but we're also seeing it in seasoned professionals. We're seeing people, particularly in areas where there's a war for talent, we're seeing people really vote with their feet and take into account how closely the purpose of a company, and for many of them, sustainability is a big part of that purpose lens as part of their hiring decision. So even as we talk with companies about their employee value equation, this is now a relevant part of it for most of them. And COP26, of course, turned up the dial. There was so much communication, there was so much in the news, there was so much focus on the topic that it's just, I think, sharpened that lens. We've all seen the Great Resignation, and a lot of that is, at risk of sounding very American, that search for meaning post-COVID. And I changed jobs post-COVID because having gone through that time, I was there, is this the place I want to spend my one precious life? And I chose my new company based on culture. And to be honest, based on the fact that they really do give a shit about sustainability. And I can't say, okay, there's a very cool thing, it's embargoed, I'll send you all an email in a week's time, that really shows how they have put their money where their mouth is on how important it is to be a sustainable and ethical corporation. It's still embargoed, okay. We'll send an email. But those sort of things really do matter. And I was one of a significant cohort that moved, I think, for that sort of reason. Greenwashing is also close to a thing of the past. So the kind of people, the talent you guys are going out trying to hire now, they are tech savvy. They are connected. And they are 3 Google searches away from most of the dead bodies. So it's no longer a thing to get away with just going, oh, we're very green. Again, some of the oil majors, their web pages are beautiful, but don't fully bear up to scrutiny. There's one fabulous little startup in Shoreditch called Provenance, and their whole thing is verifying green claims. So there's certain brands that now use them, and there's a little QR code if it's one of the products that they have verified. You can scan it and go right back and really get the provenance of where it's coming from. Yeah. So I think greenwashing, its days are numbered. And then, as I mentioned earlier, and this one I don't have the hard figures, this is slightly more anecdotal across my peer cohort. The diverse candidates are placing more weight on this partly because bellwether indicators. So when we talk about traditional diversity, some of the things that are harder to measure, you use gender as the bellwether. Because if a company is so bad on diversity that they haven't even got their head around gender diversity, the odds of them being good across the other measures aren't great. And the same way, a company that doesn't care or isn't making an effort towards things that are important to you, like carbon, like net zero, like all of the different elements of the ESG agenda, is unlikely to be a culture where you want to work. And as a minority, you do need to think about the culture you're going into. So I think that one is going to come through in the war for talent as well. So the bottom line is the war for talent is hot, 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 hot. And those companies with a meaningful sustainability agenda and communication of it are the ones that will win. So I think it is going to be, funnily enough, HR that are a big driver of this, because they will see the market impact. This one. Supply chains and sustainability. So my background is supply chains, and I spent, coming into the pandemic, yes, because it was before, I forget how long Brexit's been going on. Since Brexit was first announced, those of in supply chains have been weeping and rending our robes and going, you people need to get your house in order. Because supply chains are relatively complex, which now more people realize, even my mum, it's great. And we knew Brexit would fundamentally reshape them. And now COVID has also driven a need to fundamentally reshape. But touching your supply chain, it's like moving house. It is expensive, it is painful, you do not want to do it very often. So you may be moving as a freshly married couple, but if you're buying a house, you're going to look at the schools. You're going to look at, is this investment that I'm making, this disruption and trauma I'm going through, future fit for our vision? So in the same way, if you're touching your supply chain, and you probably are, because of a combination of Brexit and COVID, you must build one that meets your climate objectives, because you won't be able to go back and fiddle with it in 5 or 10 years' time. So again, it's the moving house thing. It's a big change, but it needs to fit that full vision of where it is you're going.